Hi! In this tutorial, I'm going to give you a helping hand. Okay, if you already closed the video, understandable. If you didn't, then no more hand puns. Pinky promise. We're going to go over hand structure, anatomy, and styles, talk about simplifying the hand into its basic geometric shapes, briefly go over a few proportions, and look at the main muscles artists should definitely know. Then we'll talk about how to use this knowledge in various styles and to express different emotions. Then I'm going to explain how I practice drawing hands, and hopefully I'll get you to practice as well. Since this video is for Clip Studio Paint's Tips of the Month, to go along with that we'll go over some useful shortcuts and features in Clip Studio Paint and how I use them in my studies. Lastly, we'll end with a painting demo showing you the layers and brushes I use when I'm painting various hands. Okay, so before we start talking about the hand, let's briefly go over the wrist and forearm, because you want the hands that you draw to connect smoothly to the rest of the body. I often see the forearm represented as a cylinder, but with an egg-like mass inside. This cylinder transitions into a quite boxy wrist. The radius and ulna are bones of the forearm that you may have heard before. The radius is on the thumb side and the ulna is on the pinky side. Some people like myself have a visible bump on the wrist due to the ulna here. In general, just make sure the arm is wider than the wrist. The hand can be simplified into a 3x4 box, but this looks a bit robotic, so let's round out this box. Okay, in 3/4 view, the front plane of this rounded box should be longer on the palm side. Still quite easy to draw, right? If you're able to construct this, then we are well on our way to constructing the full hand. By the way, an easy way to add on the fingers is just to divide this box in half and split the fingers 2 on each side. And from a front view, you can see that the thumb attaches at a 45-degree angle from the rest of the hand. And now, are you ready for some math? Don't worry, it's not too much. The length of the middle finger is about equal to the length of our hand box. If we look at the individual fingers, the geometric shape it simplifies to is like a cylinder. But let's do a quick modification and just make a rounded cut right at our fingertips. It kind of looks like the front of a ship. Now, each finger can be divided into 3 sections. If we start at the section closest to our knuckles, then we see a similar pattern of the next section being about 2/3 the length of the previous section. This can even extend to our fingernails at the very end. If that's confusing, don't worry about it. I don't think I've ever used a ruler to measure out the length of each finger section, and I don't think you should either. Instead, we'll go over another way to accurately place the fingers. Okay, before we end off on the fingers, know that the palm side in general has a lot more fleshy, soft parts. And the same goes with our fingers. There's some tiny fat pads to soften our impact, so there are these curves on this side of the finger. And this is the most obvious when you curl up your fingers. Okay, lastly, the thumb. I think we can all guess that the thumb is fatter than our fingers. The important thing to know is that it starts right at the connection to the wrist. It's also a little bit crazier than our fingers, with much more exaggerated curves. Okay, so why did I tell you all those proportions? Well, knowing the middle finger length is equal to the palm length in an orthographic view can be helpful when the hand is placed in a foreshortened view. If the fingers are closer to the viewer, then we know that the middle finger length should be longer than the hand length. Likewise, if the fingers are going away from the viewer, then we can make sure our hand length is longer than our middle finger length. There are a lot of poses with the hand, where some segments are foreshortened while others aren't, and this is where the 2/3 proportion pattern for the fingers is less useful. Instead, I like to use gesture lines. As long as the fingertips and the knuckles align in a smooth, nice, flowing line, then the hand should look alright. Another useful gestural line is the hand to wrist connection. The line from the wrist should flow smoothly into the index finger. Remember, it makes a rounded box. Imagining a hand without the thumb simplifies things a lot. You can just stick on the thumb afterwards. So we covered a bit of anatomy, but let's get into the 3 muscles any artist should know when drawing the hand. On the palm side, we have 2 teardrop fat pads, the thenar eminence on the thumb side and the hypothenar eminence on the pinky side. From the back view, we have the first dorsal interosseous right by the index finger, but you can often see the hypothenar eminence wrapping around the backside. If you can't remember the names, that's okay. Call them whatever you want, as long as you know where they are and what they look like. The last bit of anatomy we'll cover are the knuckles and the tendons on the back of the hand. The metacarpals are bones that extend from our wrist bones, the carpal bones, and we normally refer to the ends of these bones as the knuckles. This can be simplified kind of like another egg shape. The stringy tendons go to our fingers so that we can stretch our hands. Something useful to notice is that the knuckles show up more with a clenched fist, especially the ones on the index and middle finger, and the tendons on the back of the hand can appear more when they're pulled tight when we open our hands. And they can be indicated just by a few lines headed towards the forearm. Phew, we're finally done. Now let's talk about style. Obviously, you don't need to think about all of these structural details, but they're helpful to know so that you can choose how to best represent them in whatever way you want. So here are a few simple examples. You can go with a very basic representation, keeping the fingers like those ship shapes. You don't even need to draw fingernails. As long as you have the proportions right, then they can look like pretty convincing hands. Maybe you want to try something a little bit more boxy. You know, those muscles of the hands and even the fingernails can even be boxes. These hands obviously look more rough or rugged. Or maybe you want to emphasize the egg shapes. This can look aggressive and cool with the knuckles. It can also look soft and cartoony. It can also look very bony and kind of like a witch. Hands are extremely expressive and they can help you convey emotions of your characters. So one easy tip to remember is that when people are feeling anxious, nervous, or in general closed up, their body language will also be closed. The hands will be clenched or partially closed. The opposite is true too. Characters feeling happy, confident, and just open will tend to have hands that are also more open. Okay, well, even knowing all of this, you're not going to get any better at drawing hands until you actually start drawing hands. Getting a lot of volume and practice in is the most important part. So if you're just starting out, you're going to be drawing a lot of ugly hands. So brace yourself. Stop hiding those hands and start practicing. Trust me, it'll come in handy. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I practice drawing hands, and then maybe we can draw some together if some of you are still hesitant. So I normally do timed practice sessions, and this will help you get started because you won't get caught up making the perfect hand. If you're not done, you just gotta move on to the next one. Now, some websites have timed images that automatically scroll through for you, like quick poses, which is what I personally use. However, since this video is for a contest, I can't use images I don't own. So what I will demo for you is just doing time practices of hands from photos of my own hands. Wow, look at these. I could be a hand model, right? And of course, you can do this too. Taking pictures of your own hands to get just the right pose can be extremely useful. So of course, you can practice anywhere with just pencil and paper, but I like to practice digitally with Clip Studio Paint. So before we start, let me show you some useful tips that can help you with your practice. Since we're drawing from a reference, if you have a second monitor, it would be great to put your reference on that monitor, but if not, don't worry, you can always split up your screen. Okay, well obviously like this, it doesn't look like there's much room to draw. But in Clip Studio Paint, if you just press tab, you can go into full screen mode, and now there's a lot of real estate. But with the panels gone, it does give you room to draw, but you can't access as many options anymore. Well, here's where I share with you some of the shortcuts that you can choose to adopt if it's useful. In Clip Studio Paint, you can customize your shortcuts very freely, and it's very liberating. So I have my own little section of brushes that I use just for gesture practice, and you can create a new tool group just by dragging any brush onto the menu bar, and that'll create a new section. And I have shortcuts bound to increase brush size, decrease brush size. I also have other shortcuts to switch between brushes very easily, so that I can change brushes without accessing that menu. Now here is the list of brushes that I use for gesture practice. I have just a regular sketching brush, I have a textured brush, I have a soft air brush, and I have the G Pen tool. So the pencil and the textured brush, I'll give links in the description below where you can download it from Clip Studio Paint's asset store. Okay, so to change shortcuts, just go to File and Shortcut Settings. So go to Options, let's assign a shortcut to switch between brushes quickly. So down here we have Switch to Next subtool. And of course we can just edit this shortcut, to whatever key we want, just click Edit. And if you change it to something already selected, then it'll just prompt you if you want to overwrite the shortcut. And I'm just going to click No. And of course, we can also add multiple shortcuts. So both of these keys would do the same thing. And delete shortcuts. So everything's very intuitive. Okay, here's my list of useful shortcuts. So on the left here are shortcuts that I added or changed, and on the right are just default shortcuts that come with Clip Studio Paint. So you don't have to follow them exactly, of course, but if something seems helpful, go ahead and take it. This is not only useful just for doing gesture practice with timed poses, but getting the right shortcuts can increase your workflow and your efficiency so that you can get down your ideas as quick as possible. Okay, let's get to it. I'm going to go through these 2-minute poses and draw 11 hands. In this video, I'll speed it up and talk over it, but I challenge you to draw with me. If you have 20 minutes to spare, then you can draw along in real time with no cuts in this video linked here. Now, these are 2-minute poses, and even if you just get the construction down and you have an unfinished hand, that's okay. Just move on to the next one. Always just keep moving. You can spend each 2 minutes just constructing the hand at first, stripping it down to its basic geometric shapes like we covered. Alright, let's get going. So for these first few hands, I started right away, just got right into it. I found it helpful to start with kind of a silhouette, so the top of the hand and the thumb here. And same with this one. Notice that the knuckles are angled. That's often more dynamic. So if you feel like you don't have enough time in the 2 minutes, just try to get down the construction as I did here, indicating where the fingers would go, placing the thumb in, and then maybe you can do some line work on top. Okay, here's an example. You're gonna draw bad hands. So I did here as well. Look at this thumb. It is way too big. So here's another quick tip. From the back view of the hand here, notice that the line of the index finger overlaps the thumb, and this happens in most cases when viewing the hand from the back. Can you spot anything wrong with this hand? I completely forgot the pinky, and that's okay. And again, so getting in those gesture lines where the knuckles and the fingertips will go in are very helpful. Alright, so this is the last one. And again, notice the nice flowing curves with the knuckles. And we are done. So hopefully you followed along in the real-time video. It's always nice after a practice session to zoom out and look at all the work you did. Before we move on, one last note. You can also play around with the time too. Don't just stick to 2 minutes. You could try 1-minute hands, just getting down the gesture, or 5-minute hands where you complete one and try to render. For instance, here's another session where I did 5 minutes per pose, and this is where switching between brushes quickly can come in handy. If you have extra time, try to really study the pose. How is the form turning? Maybe even try shading the hand, or putting in the cast shadow. And if you're doing long 5 or 10-minute poses, and you feel like you're done, then just draw it again in a different style. Use up your time and focus during the whole practice session. Okay, I hope you practiced drawing some hands. For our last section, we're going to go through lighting and coloring with a painting demo. And I'm going to show you all my layers that I use in Clip Studio Paint. I start off just blocking in the gesture of these hands with the soft airbrush, just getting in the general shape and flow of the fingers. Then, afterwards, I make nicer line art with the pen tool. I kind of made a mistake here, as I kept the gesture, block-in lines, and the line art on the same layer, but I'll live with it, because the lines will simply get blended in to the painting stage, for the most part. But if I were to do it again, I would keep the line art and the gesture lines on a separate layer. Okay, with the line art done, I created another layer on top, and clipped it to the layer below, and I filled in the line art with a saturated red. This will help it kind of blend into the painting. Now I created a new layer, and I placed it below the line art. I filled in a rough local color for each hand, experimenting with different skin tones here. Now on a new layer, clip to the one below, I use a soft airbrush to brush in some warm tones on the fingertips and near the knuckles. I also airbrushed a few cool tones on the back of the hand. It can appear cooler here because the veins are visible from the back of the hand. After that, just one more layer, where I start adding in more tone and giving the hands form. I use a darker tone and blend out some areas. This was all done with the default dense watercolor and transparent watercolor tools in Clip Studio Paint. The important thing is just still knowing the structure while you paint. For example, painting the thenar eminence on the middle hand like I would a sphere, and treating the wrist on the left hand like a box. Also, looking at the left hand, the tendons and knuckle area can get lighter in value. Finally, I add some finishing touches and erase out some of those distracting gestural lines. So if I kept that on a separate layer, I could have just hidden it, but oh well. Another thing I like to do is that if the line art is too hard and distracting, then I duplicate the line art layer, apply a Gaussian blur to it, and play around with the opacity. Again, this helps to blend the line art a little bit more into the painting. One last thing to note, if you haven't already noticed, darker skin tone hands usually have much lighter skin on the palm side, as you can see on the hand on the right. My bad. Did I say I already added finishing touches? Well, I noticed a few mistakes hours later, so I created one last layer on top and added finishing touches. I tend to notice my paintings get a little bit desaturated, so I also added a last adjustment layer to bring up the saturation. So here's a final review of my layers. The two red ones are the line art, one with a Gaussian blur. The blue one here is the base color I put on. Two clip layers include the soft blur for general warm and cool areas, and the main shading. Finally, the purple area is some finishing touches and cleanup. Of course, this is just how I did things this time. Sometimes I just stay on one layer. Use whatever is comfortable with you, but try out different techniques to always keep learning. Alright, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and let me know how your hand practice went. If it didn't go so well, then I encourage you to try again tomorrow. And the next day. Heck, even if it did go well, do it again tomorrow. And the next day. And the next day. And the next day. And the next day. And the next day.